For decades, the rivalry between Ali Khamenei's Iran and Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel simmered beneath the surface of Middle Eastern politics like a slow-burning fuse. It was not always visible to the world, but the tension never disappeared. Behind diplomatic speeches and international negotiations, intelligence agencies were engaged in a relentless struggle. Assassinations of nuclear scientists, mysterious explosions at military facilities, cyber attacks that crippled infrastructure, and covert operations carried out across borders all became part of a hidden battlefield stretching from Tehran to Damascus. For Israel, Iran's growing missile arsenal and its influence across the region represented an existential threat. For Iran, Israel symbolized a hostile power aligned with the United States and determined to weaken the Islamic Republic. This silent confrontation continued for years, shaping the security calculations of every government in the Middle East. Iran's strategy relied heavily on building alliances beyond its borders. Through the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Tehran expanded its network of allied militias and armed groups throughout the region. In Lebanon, Hezbollah emerged as one of the most formidable non-state military forces in the world, possessing tens of thousands of rockets capable of striking deep inside Israeli territory. In Syria and Iraq, Iranian advisors and militia groups established strategic footholds that allowed Tehran to project power far beyond its own borders. Israeli leaders watched this expansion with growing alarm. To them, Iran was not just a distant rival, it was a state building a ring of military pressure around Israel itself. Israeli intelligence agencies responded with a series of covert operations designed to slow Iran's military development and disrupt its regional networks. At the center of Iran's political system stood Ali Khamenei, the country's supreme leader since 1989. His influence extended far beyond ceremonial authority. As the ultimate decision-maker in Iran's political and military structure, Khamenei shaped the country's strategic outlook for decades. Under his leadership, Iran maintained that its nuclear and missile programs were defensive necessities in a dangerous region dominated by powerful adversaries. Israel, however, saw these programs differently. Israeli governments repeatedly warned that a nuclear-capable Iran would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East. Among the most outspoken voices on this issue was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who spent years urging the international community to take stronger action against Tehran's military ambitions. Throughout the early 2000s and 2010s, diplomatic efforts attempted to prevent confrontation. International agreements and negotiations sought to limit Iran's nuclear activities while easing economic sanctions. For a time, these agreements appeared to reduce tensions, but distrust never truly disappeared. Each side believed the other was preparing for a future conflict. Israeli intelligence officials suspected that Iran would eventually attempt to bypass restrictions and advance its strategic capabilities. Iranian leaders, on the other hand, argued that Western pressure and Israeli threats were proof that their country needed stronger military deterrence. By the early 2020s, the fragile balance began to erode. Regional conflicts in Syria and Iraq created new opportunities for confrontation. Israeli airstrikes frequently targeted Iranian-linked facilities in Syria, aiming to prevent advanced weapons from reaching Hezbollah. Iran responded by strengthening its regional alliances and expanding its missile technology. The shadow war gradually became less secret. In several dramatic moments, Iran and Israel launched direct attacks against each other's territory, breaking a long-standing pattern in which both sides tried to avoid open confrontation. These exchanges signaled that the rivalry had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. Inside Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu argued that waiting too long to confront Iran could place the country in an irreversible strategic situation. Israeli security officials warned that Iran's missile stockpile and regional alliances were growing rapidly.
Within Iran, leaders aligned with Ali Khamenei insisted that their country would not bow to foreign pressure or threats. Public speeches in Tehran often framed the confrontation as part of a broader struggle against external interference in the region. The rhetoric on both sides became sharper, and diplomatic channels struggled to keep pace with the rising hostility. When the crisis finally erupted, it did so with shocking speed. A series of military strikes targeted Iranian facilities linked to strategic military infrastructure. Explosions and emergency alerts echoed across several cities as Iranian defense systems responded to incoming threats. In Tehran, officials rushed to secure sensitive locations, while military commanders attempted to assess the scale of the attack. The strikes represented one of the most dramatic escalations in the long-running rivalry between Iran and Israel. Within hours, global news networks reported that the confrontation between the two countries had entered a new phase. Iran's leadership quickly condemned the attacks and warned that retaliation was inevitable. Military officials linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that the country possessed the capability to respond with significant force. Preparations began almost immediately. Missile units were placed on high alert, and drone operators across multiple bases readied their systems for deployment. The response signaled that Iran intended to demonstrate its ability to strike back despite the initial shock of the attacks. In Israel, the government activated nationwide emergency procedures. Air defense systems, including advanced missile interception technology, were deployed across key cities and military installations. Civil defense authorities instructed residents to remain near shelters in case of incoming attacks. The atmosphere inside the country was tense but determined. Israeli leaders argued that the military action had been necessary to protect national security and prevent future threats. The confrontation between Tehran and Jerusalem soon began to ripple across the wider Middle East. Regional governments monitored the situation closely, aware that any prolonged conflict could destabilize an already fragile region. One of the most immediate concerns was the security of global energy routes. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to international waters, carries a significant portion of the world's oil supply. Any disruption to shipping in this area could send shockwaves through global markets. As tensions rose, military forces from multiple countries increased their readiness in the region. Naval patrols intensified in strategic waterways, and diplomatic efforts accelerated in an attempt to prevent further escalation. International leaders called for restraint, warning that a full-scale war between Iran and Israel could have consequences far beyond the Middle East. Inside Iran, the leadership structure surrounding Ali Khamenei continued to coordinate the country's response, while emphasizing national unity in the face of external threats. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu maintained that the government would take whatever actions were necessary to defend the country against future attacks. Both leaders framed the conflict as a defensive struggle, reinforcing the deep mistrust that had defined relations between their countries for decades. The events unfolding in the region represented more than a single military confrontation. They were the culmination of years of rivalry, ideological hostility, and strategic competition. From covert operations to open military exchanges, the relationship between Iran and Israel had evolved into one of the most significant geopolitical conflicts of the modern Middle East. Whether the crisis would eventually subside through diplomacy or escalate into a broader regional war remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the confrontation had already reshaped the strategic landscape of the region. Governments across the Middle East began reassessing their security policies, while global powers watched closely to see how the situation would develop. For ordinary people living across the region, the conflict was a reminder of how quickly political tensions could transform into real-world consequences. Air raid sirens, military mobilizations, and constant news updates became part of daily life as the world tried to understand where the crisis might lead. As leaders like Ali Khamenei in Tehran and Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem continued to guide their countries through one of the most dangerous confrontations in decades, the entire world watched anxiously. The outcome of this struggle would not only determine the future of their two nations, it could shape the balance of power in the Middle East for generations.